Thanks, Peter. Just to pick up your point just there, after the Scottish referendum in 2014, my colleagues in the UK government were fond of saying to me that the referendum had settled things. And the bit of wisdom that we distilled out of that was that referendums answer questions, but they don't settle them. So we've been through, in Scotland, 2 years of unsettlement since then, and the only prediction I would make about what's going to happen after this referendum is that it will not be settled. It will not feel like that, and it certainly doesn't. I've got half a dozen points to make, which I'll try to do quite briefly. I hope they make sense, although I was in the city the other day speaking to a friend of mine who's a chief executive of a fund management firm, and we were comparing experiences since the referendum. And I said, we've been living from day to day, thinking that sounded quite dramatic, and she laughed at me and said, I'm living from hour to hour. So this has ripples all over the place. So 6 points, each of which I'm going to try to illustrate with a quotation. And the first one is from a very senior UK government civil servant who said a few days after the referendum, quote, "The union is back in the melting pot." And I think that is a good frame for Brexit and the union. It brings back into play some issues which haven't really gone away in Scotland, but which are now very present, I think, for my counterparts in the UK government. And reasons for that are the nature of the result in Scotland, the description by the First Minister in Scotland that for Scotland to be taken out of the European Union, having voted to remain, would be, in quotes, democratically unacceptable. And there's something here about mandates and about how those are reflected in the world that we're now in. I like the way that Peter and Akash framed this by saying that in effect we have had 4 results, not 1 result. And I think the only way I can make sense of the intergovernmental relations and the politics of this is to think of this as 4 results. 2 countries in the Union voted to leave and 2 voted to remain. And what the intergovernmental system is now grappling with is the consequences of that. I think that will be a process of negotiation between governments, and that will, the position of the Scottish Government on that I think will be, we're fond of using the phrase parity of esteem. And I said to Philip Rycroft the other day, who was to have been one of the panellists today, that we now knew that parity of esteem meant that we had each lost a referendum. And the serious version of that point is that just as in the run-up to the last referendum, we did some good intergovernmental work to produce the Edinburgh Agreement and to find a way of reaching agreement between governments rather than one government consulting another and then doing what it was going to do in the first place. I think we are back in that position now, and I'm not quite sure what shape will emerge from that, but that seems to me to be the nature of the process. Point 3 is to share with you the very first words that the First Minister said to me at 6:30 on the Friday morning after the referendum. And I made this point to a group of my senior UK colleagues because having told me that they thought the union was back in the melting pot, my impression of their impression of the First Minister was that she was in a rush to a referendum. And I wanted to give them a different perspective on that. The first thing she said to me at 6:30 that morning was not, here's the date for the referendum. It was, with a look of genuine concern and some shock, it was, what have they done? And her first reaction to this is to think about the damage that this might do to Scotland, to Scotland's interests, to its relationships with the European Union within the UK. And in all of her public statements since then, that thread has run through this, and she's been made very clear that while she does regard a second independence referendum as an option that needs to be on the table, she's also been very clear that it's not her starting point. And I think it's important to understand that to see how this will play out. Point 4 is a quote from this morning's Telegraph. It's always good to be told what to do by the Telegraph. Its advice to the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, it says she will have to turbocharge her Brexit department. She needs to move hundreds of civil servants into it and order the mandarins to make this their priority. If you think that machinery of government is the answer to this question, then you're probably not understanding the question, I think. And a personal reflection on that is the problem of churn. Since the referendum, I have sat in rooms with my new colleagues from the Cabinet Office Europe unit, and the phrase that I take away from that is, I've only been doing this since Monday, but it seems to me that. And what we're trying to do in Scotland is to bring back together, not to create new machinery, but to bring back together the people who have dealt with these kinds of issues over the last, since 2007 and probably before that, if you go back to the original devolution settlement. So how the civil service as a whole brings to bear the knowledge and expertise that it has is a bit of a challenge in this new set of circumstances. Point 5 is, I don't really have a quote, but perhaps if I did it would be "here we go again." And it picks up Akash's point about the emergence of some kind of quasi-federal system. It seems to me that what we have done over the last decade or more is done sort of ad hoc federalism by addressing issues as they arise. We addressed the desire for self-government in Scotland through devolution in the first place. We addressed the question of whether Parliament or the people are sovereign through the Edinburgh Agreement. We've addressed the question of funding and whether the Barnett formula still works for a tax-raising government through the fiscal framework. And we do each of these as a one-off negotiation, and we don't really produce a structure that people would recognise as a federal structure. Maybe that can't be done, but here we go again. We're about to get into another negotiation in which we try to make sense of what the referendum means for the quasi-federal structure of the UK. And final quote is from an article by the Irish columnist Fintan O'Toole a few days before the referendum. And the headline of his article was, with a nice sense of irony and his tongue slightly in his cheek, "Is England ready for self-government?" The thoughtful point he was making in the article was that one of the consequences of a leave vote might be that his words were that England might stumble towards independence. And it's a theme of a lot of IFG work in the past, which is the only country in this union that doesn't have a parliament and a government of its own, is England. And I think what we're about to see is going to throw that question even more sharply into relief. If you live and work in Scotland, it's felt in quite sharp relief for some time, but I think it has been present in the referendum campaign and will be present in the aftermath.
Ken, thank you very much.